And we also get a sort of an ongoing panic on the part of the Soviet authorities about this. This is something we see in the West at times as well, slightly different in nature. But the panic is, young people are out of control, that, they're being lost to the Soviet system.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app so that you don't miss out on future episodes. Beginning with the death of Stalin in 1953, the 60s era of the Soviet Union was just as vibrant and transformative as in the West. The ideological romanticism of the revolutionary years was revived, with renewed emphasis on egalitarianism, equality, and the building of a communist utopia. Mass terror was reined in, great victories were won in the space race, Stalinist cultural dogmas were challenged, and young people danced to rock and roll and jazz. My guest is Robert Hornsby, who's the author of a new book called The Soviet Sixties, who's examined this remarkable and surprising period, showing that even as living standards rose, aspects of earlier days endured. Censorship and policing remained tight, and massacres during protests in Soviet cities alongside invasions of Hungary and Czechoslovakia showed the limits of reform. The rivalry with the United States reached perhaps its most volatile point. Friendship with China turned to bitter enmity, and global decolonization opened up new horizons for the USSR in the developing world. I'm delighted to welcome Robert Hornsby to our Cold War conversation.
When I started to teach a course on this period at the University of Leeds, I scrabbled around for a suitable sort of entry-level book for students. And the closest thing I got to was William Taubman's Khrushchev biography, which is a fantastic book. But it's a biography of one man, and I wanted something much broader. And I also don't see the end of Khrushchev as the end of a period necessarily. We'll maybe come on to that in a while. So partly this was kind of for my own purposes as a teacher. Partly also it's because I thought there were really good stories that should be told in all of this, that should rather have a bit more attention. And there's been, for the last, it's more than a decade now, maybe even 20 years, there's been quite a sort of blossoming of research on the Khrushchev era. So from things like development projects in Central Asia through to questions of sexuality and public health, all kinds of interesting work has been done. By no means all of it by me, I should say. And I wanted to sort of bring this together and sort of push it out to a wider audience.
What I really like is you've written this book in an accessible way, and it does work with a wider audience. It's not one of those dry academic tomes that sometimes crosses my desk, so I really appreciate that. Now, whilst the title is called The Soviet Sixties, you're essentially covering the period in the book from the death of Stalin in 1953 through to December 1969.
Yeah, so I used the 60s rather than a decade starting in January 1960 and ending in December 69 as a notional era, rather than, much the same way as we do in the West. We talk about the 60s in a sense. Certainly in the US, for example, there are big debates about the chronology of the 60s. Does it end in 73, 74? Or so it's not a decade so much as a period. And it's, lots of the things that we see in the West as the 60s of, changing youth culture, of rising living standards and education levels, and all sorts of things which kind of make the 60s a vibrant period in Britain, in the US, and also in the global South. There's, an increasing literature now on increasing interconnectedness between countries, rising living standards again, these sorts of things, different political currents going on. So the Soviet Union, I would suggest, is part of this. It's not the same as everywhere else, but definitely there are identifiable strands and themes which we can, see in other countries too, as a 60s idea.
So the book starts with the death of Stalin. Now, at this point, there's a leadership team in the Soviet Union, and there's a jostling for power.
Yeah, very much so. So essentially, Stalin during the post-war years, obviously very much the kind of the standout figure of the Soviet leadership, but he has a team around him of various sort of stripes and personalities, whether it's the sort of secret policeman slash monster Lavrenti Beria, or whether it's Vyacheslav Molotov, very much a hardline Stalinist, and other people as well. And obviously when Stalin dies, they're the ones who are in pole position to succeed him. But Stalin, like so many dictators of different kinds, doesn't anoint an official successor by any stretch. There are signs that the successor will be Georgy Malenkov, but it's by no means sort of, cast in stone that Malenkov will be Stalin's successor. And actually, he doesn't get very long at the front of the pack. So Malenkov has all kinds of strengths. In many ways, he's kind of the most able of the leadership. He's not quite the sort of fundamental hardliner that Molotov is. He's certainly more subtle and educated than, say, Khrushchev. But equally, he doesn't seem to have the same kind of political cunning and guile, and Khrushchev in particular is able to get round Malenkov. Khrushchev is someone who kind of manipulates and maneuvers his way around people, but he surprises people. He's not a particularly subtle thinker by any stretch, but he is tenacious and determined and cunning, I suppose you'd say as well. So yeah, he's quite able to sort of start barging people aside one by one. And probably the key moment actually to note in this section, certainly for this first chapter, is what happens to Lavrenti Beria. So Beria, basically, probably lots of your listeners will already know something about Beria, or they'll have seen that great movie, The Death of Stalin, by Armando Iannucci. Beria essentially is this sort of terrifying secret policeman who allies himself to Malenkov in the succession struggle. He's aware that for another Georgian to be leading the country seems like it might be a bit unpalatable to the Russians, Ukrainians and others. So Beria kind of thinks, at least in the short term, I'll sort of go in the slipstream behind Malenkov. The problem is that the others, they've lived in fear of Beria for many years, and they're still afraid that, he's in charge of the security organs. He's spying on them. There's no question about that. He has essentially a security setup which is huge and very powerful, and they're all afraid of what Beria might do if he gets the chance. It seems they also think he's worryingly radical in some respects. So Beria proposes and enacts a variety of reforms, or takes the lead on a variety of reforms. Surprisingly liberal for someone who's quite clearly a very dangerous and cynical individual. One might speculate that actually he's sort of playing the liberal card in his bid to get to the top, that this isn't sort of his natural position. It's one he's going for. Either way, the other guys at the top very quickly decide that we're going to have to deal with Beria before he deals with us, ultimately. And Khrushchev is the one who takes the lead in this. And at considerable danger, I should say, if the plot to get rid of Beria goes wrong. I mean, we can only speculate, but certainly it could have got very ugly for Khrushchev and other members of the leadership. So essentially, they lure him to the Kremlin. This is a repeated theme of the era of kind of elite squabbling, the fake Kremlin meeting. So they lure him to the Kremlin for a regular chat about the economy, as far as I can recall, and then they surprise him by arresting him, and they get Zhukov and some other army guys to basically bundle him into a carpet and sneak him out of the Kremlin in the dark, and he's arrested and eventually executed. And that's the sort of the key moment at which the leadership struggle looks like it might turn ugly but doesn't. He's dealt with in a very Stalinist fashion. Violence and lots of fake accusations about crimes. He's guilty of stacks of real crimes, but they actually find him guilty of spying for Britain and all sorts of made up nonsense. It has a very Stalinist feel to it. But that actually is the moment at which political life, once the dangerous Beria is gone, starts to become, if not quite regular, then at least less sort of bloodthirsty. And, Khrushchev sort of sidelines his rivals with some degree of comfort, I suppose, but slowly.
Is there a vote amongst the Politburo, or how does a leader of the Soviet Union in this period become leader of the Soviet Union?
Well, it's all a bit tangled, really, the sort of institutional legacy left by Stalin. So I suppose the two key sort of structures within the Soviet Union, you have the party and you have the government. So in this case, Khrushchev is head of party, Malenkov is head of the government. So that means he's in charge of ministries. He's prime minister, basically. So he's in charge of, defense overall. There is a defense minister, but Malenkov sits on top of all those guys, KGB and all the other ministries, health and all that stuff. And Khrushchev is in charge of the party, which is ideological questions, essentially. The trouble is that under Stalin, these two structures have largely been fused. Stalin is head of both. So it kind of all comes under his umbrella. So when he's gone, it's not entirely clear where real power lies in the Soviet system. Malenkov thinks it lies in being head of government. Khrushchev is probably the only one who thinks actually being head of the party is what you want to be. Stalin has largely sidelined ideological questions, but Khrushchev steadily makes the sort of party more and more important within structures of power. So the party and ideological questions become increasingly important in decisions about foreign policy, for example, and all kinds of domestic policies. So Khrushchev sort of inflates his platform steadily, and the party becomes more and more prominent as opposed to government ministries and so on. They are intertwined, of course. Malenkov and so on, they're also in the party leadership and not just in the government. But essentially, this is the key thing. There's a decision very soon after Stalin that we need to keep party and government jobs separate so we don't get this one-man dominance again. And so that's agreed. And ultimately, however, once Khrushchev gets around Malenkov and forces him out, he takes on the government job as well. So Khrushchev does exactly what they've all promised never to do again, which is combine party and government posts. So he's guilty of some quite serious, let's say poor form, at least in this respect, a very sort of cynical approach. And in fact, actually, it's when Khrushchev is booted out in 1964, they have the same deal again. Brezhnev as head of party, this time it's Kosygin as head of government, but they don't mix the positions again. They actually stick to the promised deal of we'll distribute power a little bit more within the elite. But yeah, essentially Khrushchev is able to sort of hoover up more positions and influence across the middle of the 1950s. There is no formal vote. There is no single moment at which you can say Khrushchev is definitely now the one in charge. But what you can see is an increasing kind of power and influence within the Soviet elite.
And in February 1956, it's Communist Party Congress, and Khrushchev delivers the so-called secret speech where he denounces Stalin.
This is one of the big moments, and this is one of those moments where you can kind of see that Khrushchev's status takes another leap forwards, this is increasingly clear by this stage that he's the man in charge, even if there's no official sort of announcement that he's now in charge. So the secret speech is really, really interesting moment, and I could happily talk about the secret speech alone for hours and hours, but I promise I'll try not to. So there are all kinds of questions about why this happens. Is this Khrushchev essentially stealing a march on his remaining rivals, that he's saying, I'll tackle the Stalin issue and then you guys will look bad because you hid from this? Is this really about the Stalin issue? We've let maybe 2 million people out of the Gulag. We've changed all kinds of important policies, and we've not sort of renounced the man who created all this stuff. We've pushed for a ceasefire in the Korean War. Our foreign policy toward the US is changing in all kinds of ways. Former enemies back on the streets. This won't make sense to people unless we explain what's happened. So there's a sense that maybe you have to sort of renounce Stalin. Renounce Stalin is slightly a simplification, sort of take on selected crimes of Stalinism, let's say. There are all kinds of questions about how and why Khrushchev sort of takes on this subject. There are also interesting kind of issues, very revealing issues about what he says and what he doesn't say. So when Khrushchev is sort of giving the secret speech in February 1956, there's a lot that he chooses not to raise. He obviously, in doing this, has to balance several things. One of which is he doesn't want to kick off revolution in his own country by destabilizing the whole system. What he wants is a sort of a selective approach which takes on some aspects of Stalinism without sort of delegitimizing the remains of the system, because Khrushchev is one of Stalin's creations, let's say, and so are pretty much all of the leadership. So he wants to find a way of essentially saying, we're done with that, but we're okay again now. And what he does, he talks about a return to Leninism. So Khrushchev says, basically, the system created by Lenin, and in this he's very selective in his understanding of what Lenin did, he says that was fundamentally sound. What happens is, and Stalin also made big contributions, but he also made terrible mistakes because he was sort of an egomaniac and he was suspicious and so on. And he suggests essentially that what happened under Stalin, or the mass terror in the late 30s and disasters in the war, these are not the result of a fundamentally rotten system, but of a system that Stalin has taken and corrupted. And what Khrushchev says is, we're going back to Leninism. We're going to go back to the start and get rid of these sort of ideological aberrations and cruelties of Stalinism. And it seems that this, for a time at least, gets people enthused again. There is a sense among many people in the Soviet Union that the revolution, the project started by Lenin, building communist utopia, is one that we need to try and save. That actually, yes, terrible things happened in this country under Stalin, but we can now mend that system and move it forwards. This enthusiasm, it has a certain shelf life when it turns out that the communist utopia isn't necessarily coming anytime soon. But certainly there is a kind of a rejuvenation ideologically within the country for a time. That said, there's also a considerable strain of sort of support for Stalinism, which it's easy to forget about in history. So Khrushchev doesn't have it all his own way in this respect. There is still today, there is considerable sympathy and respect for Stalin in the former Soviet Union, in some quarters especially. And we see this with the big and deadly riot in Georgia in March 1956. So Georgia being Stalin's home republic, even before the kind of details of the secret speech are out fully, it's quite clear in Georgia that some kind of disgrace has happened for Stalin. And this is on top of the disgrace of Beria 3 years earlier, also Georgian. And this really sort of inflames national sentiment in Georgia to a considerable extent. And it triggers several days of rioting, which ends with the army being called in and people being shot and killed. So this is really explosive stuff right across the Soviet Union. Khrushchev is, he's essentially denouncing, if not outright denouncing Stalin, at least denouncing aspects of Stalinism, which have for years and years been heralded as, the truth. This is right at the core of what our country is. Stalin is an iconic figure for young people. Their school lessons are all based around, learning Stalin's biography and admiring and emulating Stalin's behavior and so on. This is a really big deal. And for some people, this return to Leninism is sort of rejuvenating. But for other people, this is a really sort of shattering blow. And the idea of the scales falling from people's eyes as they're saying, well, this system stinks, basically. There are all kinds of problems. Some people want more revelations and more action, tackle the other criminals. Why isn't Molotov going to jail? Why aren't members of the Politburo being arrested for what they did? Why are you pretending it's all about Stalin when actually, it's also the newspapers and the movies and everyone that was glorifying Stalin? This scares the Soviet leadership pretty quickly. Khrushchev wants to keep this issue quite narrowly defined. And there's an element of people who don't want it to be raised at all, the Stalinists, and others who say you have to go further and faster with this, otherwise it's hollow. Very tricky situation to manage, and he does not manage it especially well, I have to say.
No, because even outside the Soviet Union, the sort of genie is coming out of the bottle there to some degree, with riots in Poland and the Hungarian uprising in the autumn of 1956.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not solely caused by Khrushchev and the secret speech. There is a sort of, a tail to this. There are legacies of Stalinism. So the Stalin period in sort of communist allied Eastern Europe, really it's forcibly occupied. It's more sort of imperial than an alliance, you might say. But yeah, there are painful sort of wounds of Stalinism. They've had the same sort of experience of mass repression and terrible living standards, and they're essentially, Poles and Hungarians and others have been sort of squashed behind Russians, especially in the sort of Soviet pantheon. And so these legacies are already sort of painful enough. And then the secret speech, what you find is that while it's okay for Khrushchev to denounce Stalin, because Stalin is 3 years underground by this stage, if you're in Hungary, for example, Rákosi, who has been, an out and proud Stalinist his entire career, because that was the thing to do until February 1956, suddenly, the Stalin of Hungary has everyone in Hungary saying, well, hang on, our Stalin is still here and he's in power. And we see much the same sort of thing in Poland and elsewhere, that this, and Ulbricht in East Germany, that this quickly proves explosive, not just in the Soviet Union, but in the allied countries of Eastern Europe as well. Typically for Khrushchev, has not forewarned any of these guys of the storm that's about to come. And this is also a point at which Mao in China says, well, you might have told us that this was coming. This is a big deal. In China, they also celebrate Stalin around this time and continue for a while. So this has sort of really big ideological ripples that spread out way beyond the Soviet Union. In Hungary, it proves particularly explosive, and it's not the only factor in the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, but it is a factor. And this is a revolution which sort of, I suppose, tips over into full-blown revolution with the pulling down of famous pulling over of the Stalin statue in Budapest. It's a revolution when a statue comes down, essentially. And this ends with the Soviet invasion, which kills a large number of people in Hungary. It's a very sort of violent episode. And this is the end of 1956. And it looks for all the world like Khrushchev's sort of promise to abandon Stalinist terror in February 1956 has been completely sort of betrayed and backtracked upon by November 1956 already. And so this idea of rejuvenation of, a project which, will be more, I suppose, humane is the best way of thinking about it. That already this looks like it's gone up in smoke by the end of 1956.
And even Khrushchev's position is not solid at this point, because in 57 there's an attempt to oust and replace him.
Yeah, so he's a really interesting figure, Khrushchev, in this respect. So basically, history tends to remember Khrushchev relatively positively. By no means is he regarded as a sort of saint or anything like that. But compared to, before and after in the Soviet Union, he gets a relatively good press. It would be hard not to be, compared to Stalin, for example. But so essentially, Khrushchev, while he enacts various positive reforms, he's an absolute nightmare to work with, because he's, as he's gaining more power and influence, he's becoming more intolerable for the others around him. So the collective leadership, which comes together after Stalin's death, it never really disappears until 1957, but they're becoming more and more secondary to Khrushchev, the likes of Molotov and so on. And essentially, there are a few different sort of themes going on here. One is some of them, Molotov, for example, are growing increasingly unhappy about aspects of liberalization. Molotov, for example, is an absolutely dyed-in-the-wool Stalinist, as is Kaganovich and Voroshilov. They don't like the sort of political direction they're going in, especially since the secret speech. They're angry about events in Hungary, and this causes real turbulence inside the Soviet Union as well. They can't stand Khrushchev because he's increasingly aggressive and bullying towards them. Molotov especially, this is a man who's sort of, he was in the 1905 revolution. He's, fought at the barricades. I'm not sure if he did, but certainly that's how he pictures himself. And Khrushchev is this sort of semi-educated peasant farmer who Molotov basically disdains, says he doesn't know anything about ideology. And they're increasingly sort of sick of the sight of him, sick of being pushed around by him. And so they organize another one of these meetings in which, they try and get rid of Khrushchev within the Politburo. I should say Presidium, but I'll say Politburo to make it easy. It's an organization, an office, which changes name, but I'll stick with Politburo. So they basically say, well, members of the Politburo, we'll get together, we'll organize it beforehand, we'll vote him out. That's progress. That's not the Stalinist way of doing it. we'll get together, we'll decide that we want rid of him. Actually, Khrushchev does a really good job of fighting back. When he's summoned to this meeting, he has a couple of supporters in there, most notably Anastas Mikoyan, another member of the leadership, and he starts to defend himself. And what happens in this closed Politburo meeting, they get message out. One of the key figures in this, it seems, is Leonid Brezhnev, who eventually overthrows Khrushchev later down the line. And they start to round up Khrushchev supporters from the wider Central Committee. So I'll explain the sort of institutional structure of this for you. So the Central Committee is really the ruling organ of the Soviet system. The Politburo, or Presidium, is a much smaller organisation of a dozen or more people, and that essentially rules in the name of the Central Committee. Because Central Committee members are all over the place. So you've got the head of the party in Ukraine, for example, will be based in Kiev today. So he's not in Moscow on a day-to-day basis to join in. So basically, and this is true of Armenia and Georgia and all sorts of other people who are in the Central Committee but not in Moscow. The Politburo rules in their name. So the Politburo tries to get rid of Khrushchev. And then you have this sort of organizational question, which Khrushchev is able to leverage, which is, well, can the Politburo actually vote out the party leader, or does it have to be the full Central Committee? And essentially what happens is that Khrushchev has Zhukov, head of the army, and Serov, head of the KGB, on his side, and he gets them to go out using planes and everything else to fly in Central Committee members from all around the country, saying this question can't be decided by the Politburo, it has to be decided by the full Central Committee. And these people are mostly people who Khrushchev has appointed, or else has looked after over the years. The likes of Malenkov and Molotov, they hardly leave Moscow. They're kind of super elites in the Kremlin. They don't sort of mucky themselves dealing with even lower level members of the Soviet elite. But that level of elite, ordinary Central Committee members, and this is still very much a Soviet elite, their loyalty is to Khrushchev more than these other guys. And so essentially they launch a fight back and they're convinced in the end that no, you guys, you sort of half dozen plotters, do not have the authority to get rid of the head of the party. It has to be the full Central Committee, and we support Khrushchev. And this increasingly turns into an absolute humiliation of Molotov and Malenkov and Kaganovich and others. So that's basically the end of them. They try and seize power and sort of from the jaws of victory, they snatch a terrible defeat that ends with Molotov is sent off as ambassador to Mongolia, as I recall. Malenkov, if I recall, ends up managing a cement factory in the Urals. And there's two significant points in this. One is that this sort of potential Stalinist resurgence has been stopped. The other is that they've been stopped but not destroyed. They've been humiliated, but, being an ambassador's not a bad job, all things being told. So that they've not been, imprisoned and shot in the back of the neck or anything like this. So Khrushchev has kind of set a precedent for how you do politics in the post-Stalin age. You can defeat your enemies, but you don't have to destroy them, essentially. And this is a lesson which I suppose pays off for him when he's got rid of in October 1964, that Brezhnev and the guys, they don't really take seriously for a second the idea of doing him in. They force him out, and that's enough. So this is, a substantial change.
Absolutely. Now, we've mentioned liberalisation, and we mentioned a thaw right at the start. I mean, for the ordinary population in the Soviet Union, how does liberalisation manifest itself?
Well, I suppose there are a few things you could think about here. One, in terms of culture. So literature, cinema, music as well, the media, it becomes a lot less sort of dogmatic in its Stalinism. There's an element of plurality. You get, certainly in movies, for example, you'll find an increasing number of sort of comedies and sci-fi and romance films rather than just endless films, sort of propagandizing Stalin and so on. And it's much the same in literature. There's sort of a sense of a new sort of honesty or sincerity, one writer talks about, in the literature of the age. It's not just celebrating Stalin anymore. It's also kind of, tales about real life and how people actually live and this sort of thing. And the Soviet Union is a country with a huge reading sort of appetite for literature. This is by no means a sort of an elite phenomenon. Much the same with the cinema. Vast numbers of people go to the cinema every week or more than once a week. So this stuff does touch ordinary lives fairly quickly. We might also think of liberalization in the sense of absence of mass terror, which sounds like a low bar, I suppose, but this is really important, in the sense that the Soviet Union after Stalin continues to be a dictatorship, and they continue to jail people for political offences, in quotation marks, but of a completely different order to the kind that we're seeing under Stalin. So, for example, the figures I'm about to give you should not be quoted because they're slightly hazy. But certainly for the first post-war years, we see something like maybe 100,000 people arrested in any given year in the second half of the 40s for anti-Soviet activity. This can be any number, and also for lots of other crimes which are not overtly political. So the Gulag is growing the whole time, full of people who are being labelled enemies and so on. Huge numbers of these people are let out soon after Stalin dies. And by 1956, for example, from, say, 100,000 people being jailed in the second half of the 40s, a decade later, the figure for 1956 is something like 100 people jailed for anti-Soviet offences, which is obviously 100 too many in any sort of, country that you'd want to be part of. But this is a vast drop. And that's significant in all kinds of ways. And it's also, if we dig deeper into those sorts of figures, we're looking mostly at sort of jail for 5 to 10 years rather than 25 years or executed. And these are typically people who've actually, while this is not to say it's right that they've been jailed, they have actually done something for which they're jailed. In the Stalin era, it's essentially, or it can be, pot luck, basically, that you've done, led a completely blameless life and you're a goner in repression. So that's an important change too. We also see all kinds of other avenues of liberalisation in terms of sort of regime discourse on equality of the sexes, for example, on the place of women in Soviet society. So the late Stalin period is very much a very macho sort of Soviet culture, when women in particular are faced with all kinds of very heavy burdens around, most notably around childbearing. So that after huge population losses in the war, one of the key focuses of the late Stalin period is, getting the population up again. And this essentially means women having huge numbers of children, ideally, and without access to significant welfare, and a huge burden placed on women, especially in this. And what we see under Khrushchev is a return to earlier discourse about equality between men and women. It's never actually achieved in practice. There is progress in certain areas. You see, for example, at university study, the proportion of women to men is roughly equal. You see a lot more women in the sciences, for example, in the Soviet Union than you would in the West. In the Komsomol, this is the Communist Youth League, about half of members are women. So the picture is a long way short of the sort of perfect equality that authorities try and pretend. But there are also significant advances for women to be had in the post-Stalin era. There's an increasing drive to get more women into work, including into kind of traditionally male jobs and so on. There are all sorts of caveats to this as well. There are lots of sort of very traditional attitudes in various ways around, homemaking and romantic life and all kinds of things. But there is also progress compared to the Stalin era. And it's also true in regard to, for example, non-Russians. Again, this is a subject full of caveats, but the late Stalin period is one very much of quite overt Russian dominance, a sense of the Russians as clearly the superior people of the Soviet Union, sort of the big brother lifting the others up behind them. And while that remains true to some extent, we also see after Stalin more sort of toleration, shall we say, of non-Russian cultures and languages and so on. So Ukraine is one example. It might not be the best example, but we see, for example, one of the first, if not the first, sort of Ukrainian language dictionary appear. And we see a film studio making movies in Ukrainian, for example. This kind of thing would not have happened during the Stalin years. It was basically a sort of continual forced Russification in the the non-Russian republics, to a large extent anyway, late Stalinism. And again, while this is, an area in which you can say you can offer all kinds of important caveats about, any sense at which national identity becomes too challenging for an implied Russian dominance, then it gets clamped down upon. We see this in Latvia, for example, in 1959, when the Communist Party in Latvia is increasingly trying to be kind of Latvianize itself, and eventually in Moscow, patience snaps, and the Communist Party leadership in Latvia is largely purged. That means got rid of rather than Stalin era purged, obviously.
The 60s in the West is primarily seen through the lens of youth in many accounts. How is the life for younger people in the Soviet Union changing?
Well, they're changing in all kinds of important ways, and we can see kind of really big overlaps with the West, where we don't have the full sort of sexual revolution that they talk about in the West, but we do see, for example, shades of that research finds, for example, young people are having more sexual partners, they're having sex before marriage and so on. These are very much 60s in the West as well phenomenon, but we're not talking quite as sort of liberated as you might think of, hippies and free love and all that. The Soviet Union is still much more socially conservative than that. But this is also allied to another kind of key theme of the West of, popular culture, for example. So already by the time of Stalin's death, jazz is already appearing in the Soviet Union, but not in any particular major way. It's a sort of preserve of, kind of quite well-connected and well-heeled young people in Moscow, for example. But as the era goes on with, for example, Western radio broadcasting, Voice of America, as people are having access to radio sets and so on, as consumer goods start to increase, then jazz becomes more and more popular. It's tolerated more after Stalin's death, but it's never fully tolerated. Khrushchev occasionally kind of turns around and says something crude about jazz music, and then there's a clamp down, but then it reappears. And as in the West, jazz eventually turns into the emergence of rock and roll, and then you've got in time the appearance in the Soviet cultural sphere, unofficial I should say, of in time Elvis Presley, and then you've got the Beatles and all that kind of stuff. And this goes on through the 70s with Pink Floyd and punk and heavy metal, and a few years later than these things are happening in the West. So the kind of cultural waves which are in the West, they're seen also in the Soviet Union a bit later and a bit modified to some degree. And, you've got young people sort of starting their own bands and that sort of thing. And, when I've been in archives looking at sort of the Komsomol, the Communist Youth League, trying to police these new sort of rock and roll bands, and they're actually sort of vetting the set list of what bands are playing. And you can see, Russian translations of sort of Beatles songs and so on, and Hendrix songs that they're planning to play. And there's a sort of a line put through these by the Komsomol, or else sometimes they will just, give them the set list and then change it at the last second so nobody can interfere. And, the Komsomol pulls the plug on concerts and all sorts of things like this. So we see important elements of youth rebellion culturally as well as we see in the West. We also see, universities sort of booming in terms of the amount of people studying. It goes, while not fully mainstream, it's certainly growing rather than just a small elite. We're seeing thus the population becoming more educated steadily. There's more schooling to get through, all these sorts of things. Fashion obviously is part of this cultural scene as well. In time we have the appearance of jeans and so on. Texas trousers, the authorities call jeans at times. And we get lots of sort of propaganda cartoons mocking young men with long hair and all that sort of, lots of stuff that was probably recognizable in the West. And we also get a sort of an ongoing panic on the part of the Soviet authorities about this. This is something we see in the West at times as well, slightly different in nature. But the panic is, young people are out of control, that, they're being lost to the Soviet system. What on earth will we do in 20 years' time if all these people are listening to Western rock music and so on? So this gives Soviet authorities considerable panic at times. Actually, when you kind of read sort of personal accounts of some of the young people involved, they tend not to be sort of politically swayed. They tend to say, you know, the famous phrase is one can love Lenin and Lenin at the same time, or else a variation is, you know, you can love Lenin and Led Zeppelin, or whatever it is. That they're saying, look, we're wearing, you know, long hair and jeans, but that doesn't mean that we're not communists, that we're, you know, that the authorities have a sort of simplistic notion of Western cultural taste means politically dubious, maybe. And actually, lots of the people involved are saying that that's just not the case.
Is there a dissident movement developing at this point within the Soviet Union?
Well, you get certainly instances of protest, but they tend to be sort of quite scattered and dispersed. So you get a few big moments of unrest. You get, I've already mentioned in passing, Tbilisi in 1956. There's also a huge protest in Novocherkassk and in several other provincial Russian cities in the late 50s, early 60s. But there's not really a movement until it's really towards the end of the period, so the middle of the 60s, that something starts to appear. And this is mostly around the trial in Moscow of Andrei Sinyavsky and Yuli Daniel, these two writers who've been writing satirical accounts mostly about life and culture in the Soviet Union, and they've been sneaking them abroad through a friend who kind of takes the manuscripts, and then they get published abroad, and they've drawn big attention, and the whole time the KGB is desperately trying to find out who these sort of sneaky writers are who are mocking Soviet life, and eventually they find them. It takes years, but KGB is not quite as effective as they would like people to believe in this. It takes a surprisingly long time for them to find these guys. And they're put on trial, and this sort of triggers a string of protests which start to bring together various different people who go on to become a sort of recognizable dissident movement in the second half of the 60s. There are also, I suppose, sort of around this time already smaller groups in, say, Ukraine, for example, of, you know, Ukrainian nationalist-minded young people, thinkers, who want not necessarily to break away from the Soviet Union, but for more cultural autonomy and to protect sort of, you know, Ukrainian language and culture and so on. And so these sorts of disparate groups start to become a bit more connected by the second half of the 1960s especially. This is still, I should say, a small-scale affair. This is not sort of half of Soviet society is bubbling with talk of revolution. But there is the emergence by the second half of the 1960s of, and also a movement of Jewish people wanting to emigrate from the Soviet Union to Israel, for example, various smaller causes of ethnic Germans wanting to emigrate to West Germany, of all sorts of different peoples who want more cultural autonomy and so on. Still small scale, but starting to emerge by the second half of the 60s.
In October 1964, Khrushchev is deposed. Why does he run out of road?
It's not totally dissimilar to the close scrape in 1957, actually. In part, it's because he's essentially offended everyone around him. So he's quite openly sort of rude and bullying to various of his colleagues, sort of mocking them openly, and there are various accounts in the book of him being quite openly sort of dismissive and saying, oh, he's shit, you know, all that sort of thing. So increasingly, these are sort of very elite men who are sick of being belittled and bullied by Khrushchev. He's also talking, he's getting on by this stage, he's into his 70s. He's also talking about retiring, so he kind of creates this question of, well, what comes next, but without actually retiring. So he's created an environment of people waiting for change, but there's, you know, Stalin did the same, but he's a lot more powerful than Khrushchev is. He also kind of talks at various stages of, he looks around the Politburo and says, you guys are all old, I'm going to bring in some new blood, we need new people. And so you've got lots of guys in the Politburo who are saying, he's going to get rid of us. We've amassed all these sort of privileges and positions of power and prestige. I don't want him to get rid of us. So essentially pretty much everybody within the Soviet elite increasingly starts to feel threatened by Khrushchev. Partly some of them don't like his sort of liberalizing policies, although there's not much liberalization going on by the mid-60s. I think this is somewhat overstated by some scholars, shall we say. the idea that this is kind of conservatism fighting against liberalism. Khrushchev is really not very liberal-minded by 63, 64. He's increasingly hard-line as the years go on. Certainly by the mid-60s, that's true. So for some people, it's political. For some people, it's personal. For some people, it's about kind of protecting themselves. And also, it's true that Khrushchev has become increasingly unpredictable, and he's making some really quite poor decisions in the last couple of years of his leadership. So the Cuban Missile Crisis is the big one, obviously, that, this was your fault, you humiliated us nationally, that you've offended all sorts of our allies by being sort of rude and bullying towards them as well. Essentially, the sort of charges against Khrushchev stack up. And some of them you say, well, this isn't entirely fair. But most of them you say, well, actually, yeah, he's made a mess of all sorts of policies and reforms. And eventually, this sort of just becomes part of a growing pile of reasons why it's time for him to go. And actually, when he goes, it looks for a time like this might actually have been the thing that was needed. And this is not just to conservatives. So the first few Brezhnev years after the end of 64, it looks like he's going to be a sort of a more liberal-minded, technocratic version than Khrushchev, who's interfering in everything. He's domineering. He's making pronouncements about, art, for example, about which he knows nothing. And Brezhnev's approach is essentially, well, at least in his first years in power, I won't sound off about things I don't know about. I'll be nice to colleagues, which he is. So other people at the top like working around him, because he's polite and he talks to them and he asks them and so on and so forth. And other, members of the cultural elite, they've had enough of Khrushchev, because as much as he's been behind a lot of liberalization during the period, he's also been behind lots of kind of shouting and haranguing and bullying of cultural figures as well. He's got a very mixed sort of account card with the cultural intelligentsia in terms of, benefits and drawbacks. So, yeah, I suppose Khrushchev sort of runs himself out of road in a lot of ways. And, also the simple point of time catching up with all of us eventually, that, he was becoming, increasingly erratic and difficult. And, as I said, he was also talking about retiring, that he was, growing tired, and occasionally, in a sort of self-pitying moment, he might say, well, my work is done, they can carry on without me. And I guess, they took him seriously eventually.
But as you say, he prepared the ground in terms of a leader being able to exit relatively gracefully, rather than the shot in the back of the head during the Stalin years.
Yeah, so Khrushchev basically gets to live out his days on a farm, essentially. Well, kind of, a dacha outside Moscow. So he's not jailed, he's not humiliated, he's unpersoned, which means that essentially he's never to be mentioned again. So on the day, the 15th or the 16th of October 64, they basically say Khrushchev was asked to retire because of ill health, which is not true. And then early 70s, there's a notice in the paper saying former Soviet official Nikita Khrushchev has died, and that's it. So a couple of lines of text in the newspapers, and this is a guy who had like 5-hour speeches printed in the press up until October 13th, 1964, and then after that it's a couple of lines when he's ousted, a couple of lines when he dies, that's it. So he's certainly not given any sort of, respect by those around him. But as I said, his family aren't jailed, he's not thrown in jail, he's given a dacha outside Moscow to live in. He's better off than the average pensioner, that's for sure. And he actually becomes a bit more interesting in retirement as well. So he starts listening to Western radio stations as well. He doesn't like the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 68, for example. He starts to rethink position. He apologizes to various people that he's harangued when he was in power. He privately sends sort of notes of contrition saying, I'm sorry, I was out of line when I called you a son of a bitch or whatever. And there's a famous moment that he has Dr. Zhivago, the novel, banned, and Boris Pasternak, the writer, is harangued endlessly. And this is all because somebody has told Khrushchev it's ideologically harmful as a book. It's not that he's ever read it himself. And in retirement, he gets hold of a copy and he reads it and says, oh yeah, no, it's not so bad actually. So there are lots of moments like that when he sort of reassesses his own past.
He mellows in his old age, by the sound of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And he kind of pulls a really rebellious trick, which is he gets his son to bring him a dictaphone and starts to record his memoirs. And these are available in 3 huge volumes. It's really not very reader friendly, unfortunately. But he starts to record everything from from before the revolution through life, running Ukraine before the war, and life in Stalin's elite and his time in power. And they're a really interesting source for historians. But he's doing all this secretly on his dacha in the countryside. And when the KGB get wind of this, they're demanding the tapes, and he's saying, I'm not recording anything, and then I'm not giving you anything. He's becoming quite openly rebellious. And he eventually sends the tapes abroad, and they're published abroad. He's kind of forced into saying they're not real, they're not authentic, this is a Western plot. But they absolutely are real and authentic. So yeah, he's quite an interesting rebellious sort.
I interviewed his son. I did a 2-parter, an earlier episodes, and it was fascinating speaking to him because he could remember meeting Beria and seeing Stalin and Red Square on the Lenin Mausoleum, and gave some quite interesting insight because when Khrushchev came to power, he was in his 20s, Sergei. So, he wasn't a youngster, and his father did, discuss some of the decisions.
I mean, Sergei Khrushchev himself sort of moved among the Soviet elite, not just as Khrushchev's son, which significant as it was, but also he was important in the armaments industry, in rocket design and so on, which was, a high prestige field to be in at that time. So he was, legitimately an important person himself, as well as being, the son of the boss.
So with Brezhnev's arrival, there's not an immediate change, but there is a sort of like deepening conservatism that comes over the Soviet Union.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So it's not a sort of a single moment at which Stalinism comes back with full force, and in fact there's never a sort of a full reappearance of Stalinism, but there are aspects which start to prove resurgent, shall we say. Basically it takes a couple of years, but the direction of travel starts to become clear prior to the Prague Spring. So the Prague Spring in 1968 is really the moment at which the die is cast in the Soviet Union that the turn against reform and any sort of hint of liberalization becomes complete. That's not to say this is, as I said, not a return to sort of the mass terror of Stalinism. It's not the same thing at all. But certainly it's a quite clear and consistent rejection of reform in pretty much any respect. So things like economic reform that starts to get going in the mid-60s, that basically is strangled off. We start to see a harder position on things like nationalities questions. We get to see more sort of Russian nationalism within the Soviet system, again, sort of coming to the fore. And there's an increasing sort of hardening of attitudes towards sort of, Ukrainian, Armenian and other people, sort of national self-assertion in terms of culture and language and so on. So yeah, this is mostly sort of steady change, and it's by no means a complete reeling back of the whole sort of Khrushchev agenda. But what we see under Brezhnev in some ways also, though, is a sort of improvement of some of the reforms under Khrushchev. So this is one of the more striking sort of things of the age, that in the West people have traditionally thought, this is a horrible oversimplification, but sort of Khrushchev, liberal, good, Brezhnev, conservative, bad. And that always jarred because lots of people who lived in the Soviet Union had a fairly different experience of it, which was Khrushchev period, some liberalization, but quite chaotic and still pretty poor living standards for a lot of people. And under Brezhnev, actually, you have stability, which eventually becomes stagnation, which is not ideal either, but stability nonetheless. We have less sort of crises. We don't get another Berlin crisis or Cuban Missile Crisis or U-2 crisis or any crisis that Khrushchev can sort of make worse by shouting and bawling the whole time. Living standards are going up considerably from the second half of the 60s into the 70s and beyond. So for many people, by no means all, the Brezhnev period is seen as a sort of a golden age, might be too strong, but certainly it's seen in a more positive light than the Khrushchev period. There's been about 20 years now of academics working on the Khrushchev period and finding lots of interesting stuff. It's also getting underway with the Brezhnev period now as well. The Ukraine war obviously has disrupted this to a considerable extent. but of people sort of getting into archives and new archival materials and thinking about things differently. And the Brezhnev period is also undergoing a kind of a reassessment as well, much as the Khrushchev period has been for about 20 years. That's just now sort of picking up pace in regard to the Brezhnev years.
The book is called The Soviet Sixties by Robert Hornsby. It's published by Yale University Press. There's links in the episode information where you can buy the book and help support the podcast. It's Cold War Conversations recommended. Don't miss the episode extras such as videos, photos and other content. Just look for the link in the podcast information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous support of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and see you next week.